no matter where you're at in your journey and how long you've been in this community, your voice, your experience matters and is worthy of being heard. Even though there's such a big disability community, disability can often feel like such an individualized experience because, as we often talk about in the community, no two experiences of disability are the same, even when you have the exact same disease. I have so many friends with retinitis pigmentosa, and every single one of us has such incredibly different experiences of vision loss patterns, age of vision loss, how quick it went, what it was like. Some of my friends with RP, like Paul Castle, for example, has pretty good central vision. Like, even though he has a very small window, what's inside that window is very good. Whereas I never had good central vision, even at the best. I was always reading extremely large print. My eyes were always shaking, so things were always really hard. I could never see details. So it's really interesting just looking at the spectrum. And of course, there's so many other things that come into play as well, like the intersectionality, right? Like, are you a gay disabled male? Are you a Black disabled female? There's so much intersectionality across the whole spectrum of being a minority. And then all of the other things, like what economic status were you raised in? What access to community did you have? What access to opportunity and adaptations did you have? Like access to adaptive sports versus never having access to anything like that. So it's so, Molly's favorite word again. Can we all say it together? 1, 2, 3, nuanced. But one thing in the community that I don't think we talk about a lot, which I feel like makes a big difference of your disability experience, is being born with your disability versus acquiring your disability. And we know that the majority of disabilities are acquired through age, accident, or illness. I will say, like, majority of my friends at this point in my life are disabled. And I have grown up in the disability community most of my life. From a very young age, I was involved at least with the blind community, and then as I got older, with the wider disability community. And at this point in my life, I would say like at least 90% of my friends have some kind of disability, most of whom have a pretty significant disability. So I am always having these conversations with friends in my life, many of which were born with their disabilities and many of which acquired them. I think it's an interesting conversation to have, and you guys know I'm never here to have these conversations out of like judgment. This is not one's better than the other. I don't care to play the oppression Olympics and argue who had it worse off, because I don't think that's beneficial. But I think what is beneficial is having these conversations around understanding each other better, building empathy and compassion for others within our own community and the different experience of disability that they might have from your own, because I think it allows us to understand each other better. And when we understand each other better and we don't judge each other, I think we as a community can better come together to create the change that we really need to see. Because one of the most damaging things that I see within our community is the comparison and the judgment, because when we compare and judge and tear ourselves down internally, it's very hard for the rest of society to take us seriously. When none of us can agree and we're all fighting, then nobody else is like, oh yeah, they're a united front trying to create change. We should stand with them. They're like, I don't know who to stand with because they're all torn apart. So I like to have these conversations, even just internally, like my own self. I love thinking about these things because it helps me better understand other people within my community. And I also go out of my way to follow disabled creators who I actually don't agree with, because I think it's really important to not live in your echo chamber. It's really important to think outside of your own narrow view. And that's how we expand our mind. And that's how I'm able to take on new ideas, to challenge my own perceptions that have been formed by my one lived experience. So I've just been thinking about this a lot lately. And interestingly enough, I don't even know where I feel like I fall. I kind of feel like I'm weirdly somewhere in between being born with it and acquiring it. Because of course, yes, I was born with retinitis pigmentosa and my other eye diseases and stuff, but it was also progressive. So even though I was born with my disease, I really identified as sighted for a lot of my childhood and slowly identified as like visually impaired, legally blind, low vision, then blind. I feel like I've lived a sighted life and a blind life. Like, I was able to identify in the world as non-disabled because I didn't use any kind of adaptive equipment during my young childhood. I played competitive sports on sighted teams. I could read and write. I could see colors and faces. And, for all intents and purposes, I feel like I have a good experience of what it was like to be non-disabled, and then to slowly have my identity, my self-identity, and my identity in society change as I started needing things like a white cane that physically identified me to the public that I'm disabled and I'm different. Having to skip class to learn how to read and write in Braille when all of my peers were sitting together learning French. And then slowly having to learn year over year more ways to adapt and change as my vision continued to decrease. And so I feel like I myself have had these experiences of acquiring a disability, even though I was technically disabled from childhood. But I do think my experience is very different from somebody who was born with their disability and that disability maintained stability. It has been the same from birth and will not change because their disease or condition is not progressive. And having a progressive disease and slowly acquiring my disability is equally very different from the experience of having a sudden traumatic accident that causes your disability, like, a surgery gone wrong or a car crash. So everybody's experience truly is so vastly different, and that's how we form our opinions. I feel like one major difference of being born with your disability versus acquiring your disability, particularly the later in your life you acquire your disability and the longer in your life you lived without a disability and lived as a completely able-bodied person or non-disabled person, I feel like the shift in your own identity is massive. When you're born with your disability, that is the identity and the life you know. The only version of you know from birth is disability. And so you learn your life that way. That's how you've always viewed yourself. Whereas when you acquire your disability, there is always going to be some form of a feeling of loss, some form of grieving, and often that grieving is a lifelong period. That's not to say that if you're born with a disability, you never grieve the idea of not having a disability. I don't know, because that's not my experience. So please, as always, when I have these conversations, I absolutely want to hear your perspective and opinions on this and your experience. If you were born with a stable disability, I'm very curious, do you or have you ever grieved the idea of a life you could have had if you weren't disabled? Because for those of us who acquire our disability, absolutely the grieving process is a huge part of it, and is something at 31, 15 years after going blind, I still have moments of that grief. I still have frustrations of thinking sighted Molly would have XYZ. Her life would have been so much easier because of XYZ. And I also think, I know for certain in my mind, even though my vision loss was gradual, there is a distinct before and after. I think of myself as sighted, then blind. There was sighted Molly, then blind Molly. Sighted Molly existed before 14, blind Molly existed after. And I am certain it is that way, particularly for people who acquire their disability suddenly. There truly is like the moments that led up to your life changing forever. And so there's a massive identity shift of going from a non-disabled person to a disabled person, accepting perhaps a new body, a new way of functioning. Which brings me to my next point of independence. Independence looks so different when you've been born with your disability and raised that way compared to acquiring it. Because when you acquire your disability, you often go from being very independent and living and functioning in a very, quote, normal way, to relearning how to do everything. And I think that was an interesting part of having a progressive disease, was I was constantly relearning. And I know that anybody with progressive diseases can relate to that feeling. They don't jump straight to screen readers just because they know that one day I'll need it. Slowly, I went from like larger print to zooming in further, to getting new equipment, to having like CCTVs and Zoom text, to then JAWS, to then voiceover. Like, it was such a progression, and it was going from being like a full-time print reader to learning Braille on the side, but then like slowly transition to needing Braille to be my main form of learning. I would learn how to do things visually because I could, and I didn't start learning how to do things tactilely until I had to, even though they knew I would have to. It's this really weird thing where constantly every single year I'd get a new IEP at school. They would do a new evaluation. I was going to my ophthalmologist and they were updating my charts on whether my vision had progressed or stabilized that year. So I was constantly having to adapt and learn new things. When I really couldn't see anymore and it was much quicker than expected, it felt like I took a lot of steps back in my independence and I had to learn to accept getting help from people for things that I hadn't previously needed help. And slowly I gained more and more independence back as I learned new skills. But independence absolutely will always look different for me today as somebody on the kind of end of blindness that I'm at compared to being sighted or having more remaining vision left. When you're born with your disability, your independence always looks the way it does. You're always learning to adapt from the beginning. You're learning new ways to do things from the beginning. Like my friends who were born blind, they just went straight to learning Braille. That's always how they learned to read and write from the get-go. When they learned to use a computer, they just learned to use it with a screen reader. That was the only way they learned to do things. And from a very young age, they needed the help, but then were able to learn the independence quicker and younger than I was losing it later in my life and having to adapt at that time. So it's definitely a lot different. And I think the other thing, ableism, and I think this intermingles with identity as well. I mean, I think everything intersects with identity, but when you're born with your disability, you're just raised with ableism. For better or worse, your whole life, you've battled ableism. You have battled society's low expectations of you. You have had to build an inner resilience and strength. You have been proving people wrong for as long as you've lived. You've learned that that's a part of your life. But when you go from not having a disability to acquiring one, all of a sudden, everybody in your life treats you differently. It's every single peer, every single teacher, every single colleague, every single family and friend. Whether they're intentionally doing it or not, they start to treat you different. And that, for me, I think was probably up there as one of the absolute hardest parts. Because I felt so frustrated feeling like I'm the same person. Yes, I have to live my life in a slightly different way, but I'm the same person. I still have the same interests, I just do them differently. I still enjoy the same music and TV shows. I still love fashion. I am still funny and sassy and sarcastic. I'm still really outgoing. I'm still very social, and all of a sudden, it's like I became invisible. It was this weird thing where I couldn't see the world and suddenly they couldn't see who I really was either, which is why I called my book Unseen. Pre-order, link down below. I really felt unseen, and that was new. And it was definitely like that when I started using a cane even. And I didn't use a cane full-time when I started learning to use it. It was a slow transition as my vision changed. But it was weird noticing how all of a sudden everywhere I go, everybody stares at me. All of a sudden, it went from people talking to me to talking to my parents about me. And that really messed with my self-esteem. It really messed with my own identity and my understanding of my place in the world. Again, this is never about comparison of one's worse or better. It's so different. Ableism sucks regardless of if you have to learn to adapt to it or if you've experienced it your whole life. But they are just a different experience. And I think with ableism, of course, comes internalized ableism, which is something that I have openly struggled with throughout my life. I hold the belief that society is inherently ableist. I just think that that's truth. Unless you're intentional about trying to unlearn it and relearn. And I went on that journey. I started that journey around 16 years old when I started learning about the disability rights movement and social versus medical model and all of these other dynamics of the disability experience. But I didn't even realize that I was dealing with internalized ableism for a really long time. And I still, over a decade into doing this work, have moments where I'm like, oh, girl, catch yourself. That's an internalized ableist thought about yourself. Flip that around. I can't even imagine what it's like to be raised your whole life disabled and your whole life hear ableist thoughts, how much others' limiting beliefs may impact your own belief of yourself. Because that's ultimately what I feel ableism does, especially when it's from a young age. If all we're ever being told is that we're not enough as we are, that we need to be changed, to be fixed, to be healed, to fit society better, how are we ever supposed to feel good enough as we are? And I did become disabled at a very young age, so I do feel like I was around ableism from a young age and internalized that. Those limiting beliefs of me and the way society changed their treatment of me made me feel like the only way I could be good enough and live the life I really wanted was to be cured. And it was a long journey of untangling that, but I feel like I often find that those born with their disability or those who acquired it from a very young age and who have intentionally worked to remove their internalized ableism compared to those who acquired their disability much later in life. I do find like when I'm watching content, those are the people who are spouting a lot more ableist rhetoric. And it's so like unintentional. I know that they're not doing it intentionally. And I do not judge those people when I see that because I understand that they're so much earlier in their journey of navigating a whole new identity, a whole new way of living, a whole new way of navigating society's perception of them, are likely completely unaware. Because when you've grown up non-disabled and you've had no connection to the disability community, like most non-disabled people, all you know of disability is the ableist beliefs, because that's what we see in media all the time, is this like inspiration porn, pity and praise, infantilization. And so oftentimes newly disabled adults are sharing pretty ableist things. This like, if I can do it, you can do it kind of vibe. And I think that that's just like a part of that person's journey. And I see a lot of this kind of, these conversations happening on Disability Talk where people are debating, and I see people say things like newly disabled people shouldn't get to speak on behalf of the disability community because they don't have enough of a firm foundation of what it means to be in this community because they're new to it. What? No, absolutely. I don't buy into that. That is not my stance whatsoever. Everybody's journey is valid. No matter where you're at in your journey and how long you've been in this community, your voice, your experience matters and is worthy of being heard. Even if, hot take, that belief affirms ableism, because that's a part of that person's journey. I didn't have access to doing social media when I was newly disabled and deep in my internalized ableism and before I had gone on that journey. But I know I would have been sharing a lot of those things, and that doesn't make that wrong. It was a part of my journey, and that's valid too. And that's why I said, like, I go out of my way to follow people even if they say things I don't believe, because I'm not here to only support and platform people who I agree with just to push my own beliefs. I don't think that that's fair. And access to community is such a huge thing. When you're newly disabled, oftentimes for people, they've not had any access to community. So their whole circle around them is non-disabled, or if they're doing things like rehabilitation, oftentimes it's mostly other people who are newly disabled as well. You're deep in the medical system, which is of course the system of trying to cure and gain back as much function as possible. And so you don't know the other side of disability life and the disability experience. And that's why it's important as a part of rebuilding your life to get involved with adaptive activities, adaptive arts and sports, to go to retreats and camps and facilities with other people in your community, to seek content from other creators with your shared disability or especially other disabilities to learn. Reading books by disabled authors, I think is all really important. And I'm grateful that my parents did involve me with the blind community from a young age, because I think that was definitely very helpful. And the older I got, like going to the school for the blind, I had lots of kids in my school with a vast variety of disabilities. Going to camps for disabled kids, I had access to a lot of different disabilities, and that really did help me open my mind. And when I did become more disabled, I had access to people who did understand me, which was helpful, even though I still often felt very alone in my day-to-day life physically. I did have access to, like once a month going to a retreat for the blind and talking to people who understood. And having community was one of the most important things. And it's one of the things that when I'm reached out to by newly disabled people and they ask me, like, what do I do? How do I rebuild my life? One of the first things I say is connect with the community, reach out to the community. And it's so scary because so often newly disabled people have this belief that, well, I'm not like them. I'm not like the other disabled people. I'm like a non-disabled person stuck in a disabled body, but I'm not like them. And I get those messages from people all the time, and it hurts me so deeply because I get these messages from people who say things like, oh, like, it's I'm so glad I found you because I feel like I'm not like any other blind people and I finally relate to you. And I'm like, if you relate to me, then you do relate to lots of blind people because I have lots of blind friends and I relate to them. I have lots of blind girlfriends who love makeup and fashion. I have lots of blind friends who love travel. It's those internalized ableist beliefs. And when you lack the community and you lack the understanding and connection, and your only connection is to non-disabled people, you're going to continue to hold those beliefs. They only hold you back from your own true healing, not just the physical healing and rebuilding, but the emotional and mental healing and rebuilding, which I think is one of the most foundational parts to rebuilding your life after becoming disabled. I think some of the other aspects that are interesting about community is when you're born with your disability, you may or may not have access to community from the start. But the other thing is likely you've often faced a lot more social isolation your whole life. It's been harder to perhaps build community. I know that many of my disabled friends who were disabled from childhood faced bullying. You guys know that I faced a lot of bullying growing up and social isolation. So it's this catch-22, but also I hear stories of people becoming disabled and losing their friends. Like their non-disabled friends don't support them, and the community they had spent their whole lives building, who they thought would be there for them, aren't. And that's really hard too. I mean, I did lose all of my friends when I went blind, and that was very difficult for me. I grew up being bullied. I finally built this friend group, and then I lost the friends. And it was so disheartening and frustrating, feeling like I had to rebuild every part of my life. Oftentimes, rebuilding every part of your life means rebuilding every single thing that you do every single day. And that's so difficult. Like things that used to be so normal are suddenly so hard, and they will be easy again someday, but you can't even see how that's possible. Like that doesn't even feel achievable. Something as simple as pouring a glass of boiling water feels like this is never going to be easy again. This is always going to be exhausting and frustrating and tiring, and I'm gonna constantly be spilling or burning my finger or XYZ, but eventually it just becomes as easy as it was when you could do it with your eyes. But yeah, it's such a, oh my God, I don't miss those days of trying to rebuild my life. Sometimes I have to look back and remember how hard it was to remind myself of how far I've come, and that even though things still feel hard sometimes, it's nowhere near as hard as it once was. And I've gotten through so many hard things that I can continue to get through hard things. But truly, I often look back at that part of my life and I'm like, I don't know how I survived. I truly don't. I think another element is social versus medical model. I think oftentimes when I talk to my friends who were born with their disability, they are more firmly rooted in not wanting a cure than my friends who went blind or became disabled later in life. My friends who were born disabled, they're like, this is just who I am. Like, why would I want to change that? This is the version of me that I know. This is the only version of me I've ever been. I'm happy with this life. This is who I was meant to be. It's who I was born as. But a lot of times my friends who have acquired their disabilities are the ones who are really rooted in like fundraising for cures, wanting to see again, wanting to walk again, not wanting to be disabled, wanting to just go back to life the way it was because it was so much easier or XYZ. They didn't have to battle all these other things. I'm really proud of the fact that I truly do feel like I've gotten to a place in my life where I don't just say I don't want to be cured. I do feel like if I never have medical intervention, like I will be fine. I've truly wholly accepted myself, and that's something that took me a long time. And I lived most of my life wanting to be cured and believing that was the only way to live a good life. And it took me a long time to let go of that hope and to just like be at peace with the fact that it might never happen and that that is okay and that my life is not limited because of that. So I completely empathize and understand with people who are still in that mindset and who might never get to a place of feeling like whole and content in their disabled body. And I just hold so much space for those people because I know what that's like. It is hard for me when I see content about that because it does take me back to a bad mental place. For me personally, holding on to the hope for a cure limited my own growth, limited my own life. Those beliefs were limiting. Letting that go entirely and closing that door was the only way for me personally to get to a place of contentment and to really thrive as a disabled person. So I see content around seeking cures and treatments, and often the way it's talked about is with a bit of an ableist undertone, and it hurts me. It hurts me for my former self it hurts me thinking of some of the feelings those people must be feeling. And it also hurts me for the people who were born disabled and who've never known what the life of being non-disabled is like, and who constantly continue to have this idea shoved down their throat that existence is inherently better than the existence of disability. Because I know that must be a very complicated, heavy thing to navigate when you're born disabled. But I do feel like when I look at the groups of my friends who are content and happy and never want to be cured, and the group who are seeking treatment and cures, 99% it's like those who were born disabled don't want to be cured, and those who became disabled do. I understand because I know how hard the journey is to get to the place of like transferring to that other side. But if that's something you do want for yourself, know that with intentionality, it is actually possible to get there. I think overall, those are the things that I can mainly think of. Sure, I've missed things because this is just what I've kind of noted from, again, like having so many friends in real life and then watching so many creators online. But I'm so curious to hear from all of you because I know so many of my followers are disabled, and I'm just really interested to hear like what resonated with you or what you think I might have gotten wrong based on your own lived experience, other things that I might have missed. Would love for you guys to weigh in down below. And as always, like please make this a space of respect and compassion and empathy and love. This is not a space of judgment or hate or negativity. This is just about building greater understanding. I feel like I spend so much of my life trying to understand what I may not, whether it's within our own community or other communities. I really believe that building understanding is how we bridge gaps in society and come together. And I think that's really important in order to actually create change. I also think spending so much of my life feeling deeply misunderstood by society has made me never want to be a person who makes other people feel that. And so I go above and beyond to learn and to understand and watch documentaries and just be educated, choose to educate myself. So if I'm confronted with something, I can feel equipped to understand. And yeah, so that's really what this is about, is sparking those conversations and maybe opening your mind to thinking of disability in a different way and realizing like, hey, when you see that creator who's maybe speaking in a very ableist way, why might they be doing that? Like, what's their background that's led them to holding those beliefs? And instead of holding judgment, holding space for that. So yeah, that's all I have to say today. Hope you enjoyed another Molly Rambles. Until next time, you can click over here to hear my perspective on can money buy your way out of being disabled? Or you can click over here to watch me react to women who want princess treatment, my perspective as a disabled woman. Bye.